BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays this year I've been talking to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery. And I hope everybody had a good New Year. This episode is coming out on January 1st. New Year's Day. You guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about Jack the Ripper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com, and I am your host, Box Ned. Jack the Ripper was a serial killer who operated in England in 1888. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. And in this episode, I'm going to be delving into the world of Ripper Criminology, and I would like to give a shout out to Black Box Online Radio follower John Blues, who said, "I like when the facts are examined and talked about. That's when this podcast is at its best. Last week's episode was a bunch of ideas with no evidence or foundation, and that's why I wanted to take a more formal approach and a more criminological approach to the subject, if you will. The only defense I can provide is that last week's episode was called Jack the Ripper and the Murder of Mary Kelly, Stories and Legends. So this thing about no evidence or foundation, I was discussing the book Jack the Ripper, A True Love Story by Win Weston Davies, and only chapter 1 of that book, mind you. And it was also one that isn't necessarily trying to say, oh, I've solved the Jack the Ripper mystery and here's who Jack the Ripper was. That episode was more about looking at several different stories and accounts of the life of Mary Kelly, the final victim of Jack the Ripper, and Win Weston Davies was trying to do that in his book simply by documenting them, listing them off, just saying, here are some stories that have been told about Mary Kelly, and that's why the episode was called Stories and Legends. But in all seriousness, I would like to do something that is a little bit more focused on the actual investigations in the Ripper case, because this is Ripper Wednesday, and all things Jack the Ripper are fair game. And I would like to give a shout out once again to Gina Lynn, who introduced me last year to Joe Kennedy and his book Solving Cold Cases, as well as a presentation that he gave. And we're going to look at several different things that he has shared about how does one actually go about solving a cold case, solving a murder mystery that is decades old, or something like Jack the Ripper that is more than a century old. So, firstly, I'm going to be very clear. There are a lot of influences from the FBI profiler John Douglas that we're going to see in this presentation. I've also used this material about the Zodiac Killer. For example, I do a segment every Monday about the Zodiac Killer. And I've gone through Joe Kennedy's material for Zodiac Monday, but I would like to try and do that for Jack the Ripper right now, because let's look at the suspects, let's look at the evidence, and let's look at these possibilities. And I want to know what you guys think. You can challenge any of my observations. You can challenge any of my ideas. Put them in the comments section down below. And once again, if you have something larger, you can send it to me at the email address or on Facebook at Black Box Online Radio. Firstly, how to solve a murder. Number 1, evidence, witnesses, confessions. Number 2, reading the crime scene. Number 3, the killer's name is in the file 90% of the time. Number 4, who does not belong at the crime scene. Number 5, teams solve murders. Number 6, all crimes are geographic. Number 6, most murders aren't planned. Number 7, the killer almost always tells someone. Number 8, life deterioration or improvement. Number 9, ruses, cons, tricks, and surprises. Number 10, DNA technology. And number 11, empathy, intimacy, and rapport. Well, as far as empathy, intimacy, and rapport, if we can start from the bottom and then jump back to the top, I think that that's more relevant to interrogations and interacting with a suspect, putting a suspect or person of interest in a false sense of security so that people can make them think that they're not being investigated, and then they can actually obtain some type of evidence without their knowing, or that they won't be tempted to destroy some type of evidence. As far as empathy, intimacy, and rapport. I don't think that that one's going to apply too much to the Jack the Ripper case, because not only is the Ripper dead, certainly dead, but so are all of the witnesses, so are all of the investigators. It's been over 130 years since Jack the Ripper committed the crime spree in Whitechapel in 1888. Now, the ones that I wanted to talk about the most, let's start at the points that I think are the most important. The killer's name is in the file 90% of the time. I've said this from the very beginning. I've said this from the very beginning of the Ripper Wednesday segments. I think that Jack the Ripper might actually be found in the list of 100 suspects. And it goes even beyond the suspects, because it doesn't say that the suspect is a widely discussed one. It says that the killer's name is in the file 90% of the time. And I think that there's a very good reason for that, because people are not invisible. Even if it seems like what Robert Talon would call somebody's wearing wings, just flying into the crime scene and flying out. Well, yeah, it seems like that, but that's not what's really happening. Somebody committed these murders, and that person was in the area at the time. But one point that I do still stand by, and I'm kind of shocked that I stand by this, is looking at other unsolved mysteries like the Zodiac Killer and D.B. Cooper. But I think that within the list of most widely discussed suspects, of the most widely discussed suspects, we can find Jack the Ripper, probably in the top 100. Now, the next one is going to be a very, very big question that's going to be discussed here. Who does not belong at the crime scene? Now, this is very good food for thought in the Ripper case, because let's start with the Ripper's first confirmed crime, the murder of Polly Nichols on August 31st of 1888. And who discovered the body of Polly Nichols? Charles Allen Lechmere, who also went by the alias Charles Cross. Cross was the name of his stepfather. Now, he is a widely discussed Jack the Ripper suspect. He's the suspect of Krister Holmgren and Edward Stowe, who runs the House of Lechmere channel. Krister Holmgren wrote the book Cutting Point, which I did a very brief response to, mostly looking at some comments that Krister Holmgren had written out for Black Box Online Radio, and you can find that in the episode Suspect Charles Lechmere Extended Edition here on Black Box Online Radio's Ripper Wednesday. But Charles Lechmere was 40 years old at the time. He was a car man, and he was walking to work, and he reportedly discovered the body of Polly Nichols. And both Lechmere, let's say that again. Both Holmgren and Stowe believe that Charles Lechmere committed the murder of Polly Nichols while walking to work, and then he was interrupted by another witness named Robert Paul, so he pretended to find the body, just kind of standing in place. Oh, I don't know what's going on, playing dumb, putting on an act, and that's how Jack the Ripper escaped, by pretending to be one of the witnesses. But the question is, who does not belong at the crime scene? Absolutely, Charles Lechmere belongs at the crime scene. Absolutely, he fits into that. I just told you, he was walking to work. There is nothing suspicious about that. There is nothing unusual or abnormal about that. And I know they have their old timelines and they think that there's some type of gap in the information, but I don't think that that's what this question is talking about. Who does not belong at the crime scene? This is just a guy walking to work. And Robert Paul as well. Some people think that Robert Paul was Jack the Ripper. He is also walking about on his normal route to work. And even if it's an abnormal route to work, well, that still doesn't mean that that person does not belong at the crime scene. And there's a very, simple explanation. One of the more difficult Ripper crimes to analyze is the murder of Annie Chapman, which occurred on September 8th of 1888, because unlike the murder of Polly Nichols, you don't have this very clear discovery of the body, and then you have Charles Lechmere and Robert Paul trying to track down a police officer, or they're not really tracking down the police officer, they're walking down the street. They alert a police officer who then goes back to the body of Polly Nichols, and then there's a different officer there. It's P.C. Neal, and P.C. Misen is the one that they saw and then instructed to go to the body. But again, those guys are also belonging at the crime scene. And then you have these people who are directed toward the body of Polly Nichols. With the murder of Annie Chapman, there's a different type of witness sighting, and it's actually someone who heard a sound. A man named Albert Kadash got out and went into his yard early in the morning, and then he goes back into his home, and then he goes back out into the yard again, and he hears something being pushed against a fence, and it's possible that a woman said no, and then that might have actually been the murder of Annie Chapman taking place. No matter what he heard, no matter what he saw, the challenge question is, who does not belong at the crime scene? Of course that guy belonged at the crime scene. He lived there. That's his home. And this is going to be very interesting because you're going to see that some people are going to be witnesses like Albert Kadash, and then there are also going to be people like Charles Lechmere who go on to become very widely discussed Jack the Ripper suspects. And you guys might be thinking, if these guys didn't commit the murders, well then who did? And I think this is going to be even more challenging with the September 30th murder of Liz Stride, Jack the Ripper's third victim, where she was discovered by Louis Deemschutz, who was riding his horse and pony home, and he was doing this going to the club that was run by the International Men's Workers Association. I always butcher that name and I get at least one word wrong every time, and I have to give credit to Randy Williams, author of Sherlock Holmes and the Autumn of Terror, who corrected me on one point where, in my episode from 2 years ago, I said that he was passing by with his horse and cart, and Randy Williams said no, he was not passing by. He lived at the crime scene, or he lived at the building that was near the crime scene. So, well, let's look at this line here. Who does not belong at the crime scene? That means that this guy does have a reason to be there. He's also coming home from work at his normal time, and the building is where he lived. There is a very simple explanation as to how and why he is at the crime scene, because Randy Williams will go on to accuse Louis Deemschutz of being the principal orchestrator of the Jack the Ripper crimes, although he does believe that there were 3 participants, Louis Deemschutz, Isaac Kosabrodsky, and Samuel Friedman, who were also in the same building at the time. So I think that just fits in exactly with this question. They also belong at the crime scene because they either live there or they had a reason to be in that building at that exact time. And I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to Jack the Ripper's 5th crime, the murder of Mary Kelly, which I spent the majority of last week's episode discussing. Now we're finally getting somewhere. Who is a person that does not belong at the crime scene? And I think the perfect answer is George Hutchinson. Multiple times, you guys in the comment section have said that you think that Jack the Ripper was an individual named George Hutchinson. And he is a witness to someone who may have been seen with Mary Kelly, walking with her prior to her murder on November 9th of 1888. Mary Kelly was the victim that was most severely mutilated and her body was eviscerated. The Ripper murdered her indoors, and it's quite possible that a very long exchange and conversation was taking place between Mary Kelly, because she is walking with this man for at least a reasonable amount of time to the room at 13 Miller's Court. But George Hutchinson is a man who got a very good look at this individual, and then he claims that he waited for approximately 45 minutes in the cold to see if this guy was coming out, because he knew Mary Kelly previously, had been previously acquainted with her, and he more or less got a good look at the man because he saw him walking with a woman that he knew, and he wanted to see if something suspicious was about. So he claims that he waited for 45 minutes in the cold and then walked away, because the Ripper spent a lot more than 45 minutes with Mary Kelly, probably at least 2 hours, mutilating her body. But think about everything that I just said. All that stuff that I've talked to you guys about in regards to George Hutchinson in the past. That means that he doesn't belong at the crime scene. That means that he has this very bizarre story that inserts himself into some type of peculiarity. And I mean, it's not the first time that I've mentioned George Hutchinson on the channel before. And I openly said this when I did my suspect rating episode. I thought that he was a mid-level suspect. That was my immediate impression. I can see why people would suspect him, but I couldn't discount the fact that he might just have been a total liar and just made up the story because he wanted to just be the center of attention for 25 seconds. We're not even talking about 15 minutes of fame. 25 seconds and then forever immortalized in history, perhaps. But let's look at another thing here. What does it say? The killer's name is 90% of the time in the file. Not that the suspect is on the list of widely discussed suspects. And I know I've been going through a lot of widely discussed suspects, but George Hutchinson is both. He's a witness that turns into a suspect. And was he not able to just convince everybody that he was just some type of tall tale telling witness, I mean, perhaps that could be one way that the Ripper would have evaded capture. And I particularly like what you guys said in some recent episodes about how there's this theory out there that the Ripper committed the first 4 murders and then a copycat committed the murder of Mary Kelly, and that's why her crime is so different. Well, the copycat could have been George Hutchinson because of this exact reason. He does not fit in at the crime scene. And I'm going to be 100% honest with you. I'm going to be 110% honest with you. That's insufficient evidence. That absolutely does not convince me beyond a shadow of a doubt that George Hutchinson was Jack the Ripper. But one person who thought very highly of this was John J. Edelston, who wrote about it in his book, Jack the Ripper, an Encyclopedia, a book that I highly recommend because he just gave George Hutchinson the highest suspect rating. But I also will remind you guys that the person who had an equally high suspect rating in Jack the Ripper, an Encyclopedia, was an unknown individual who flew under the radar that just simply was not closely examined. And really, I have to point out that there are numerous people whom have developed some type of personal connection to the Ripper case, and they've started exploring different suspects, and countless individuals have been looked at all up and down, and then they're just they've been put under the microscope, and ordinary residents of Whitechapel, the butchers, the bakers, and the candlestick makers have all been examined. People are looking for Jack the Ripper. But I just wanted to throw this thing out that George Hutchinson does go up a little bit in my book as a stronger suspect. Okay, now, let's look at this crime list here. All crimes are geographic. Well, yeah, of course they are. Well, are all crimes not geographic? Are they happening in outer space? Are they happening with psychic powers? Are they happening with interdimensional travel? I know what this is meant to say, but this is a completely accurate statement, but it's not the most helpful, I think, when it comes to solving cold cases. Most murders aren't planned. That's the next point on this list. With Jack the Ripper, I think that the Ripper went out to commit murder. I don't think that the Ripper was an extremely impulsive serial killer who was just literally walking down the street, saw someone and decided to attack them. Or one thing that has been theorized is that maybe the Ripper was just trying to, pass himself off as an ordinary man, which he probably was, and that maybe one of the women just looked at him and made a facial expression that he didn't like. Maybe they smirked at him, or they just laughed at his appearance, so he murdered her. I also don't necessarily think that's what happened, and this might be based too much on my own assumptions, or maybe it's just a guess on my part. But what it sounds like to me is that the Ripper is going out with the intention of committing murder, and there are a few reasons for this. Which I'll explain a little bit later on, but I mean, I think the Ripper went out to commit murder on those nights, and that he was also completely aware of what he was doing. I don't think he was going through a psychotic episode based on the amount of awareness that he showed and based on his ability to hide, if he indeed did just hide in the shadows. Because that's like the explanation that we have to get back to. Why are these people who are at the crime scenes not the Ripper? Well, that's the explanation, that they are just on their way to work, or they're coming home from work, and the Ripper hears them coming, so he hides in the shadows and runs away. Now, you want to talk about geography? If anything, that shows that the Ripper had some familiarity with the back alleys of Whitechapel, and that he knew that he could run from point A to point B without getting caught in a dead end. But even as I say that now, even as the words roll off my tongue, I have to be aware that, well, even a fool would run into a dead end and then just hide behind something or hide in the dark. I mean, that would also be entirely possible, because that's what some people think happened after the murder of Liz Stride, when Louis Deemschutz was coming home, that he heard the horse and cart coming, so he decided to hide in the shadows, and then when he just seized the first opportunity he had to run away. But the fact that is on the murder of Liz Stride, which goes on to become the double event where Catherine Eddowes was murdered in the same night, that tells me, again, that's a reason to show that the murders were planned, not impulsive, not just like she made a facial expression, so he murdered her. Well, then why on earth would he walk to Mitre Square and murder Catherine Eddowes? I think the Ripper went out with a specific intention to commit murder on the nights that he did. Now, here's an interesting point on the list. The killer almost always tells someone. This is a very big belief that people have about Jack the Ripper and why the Ripper was not caught. Some people think that the police didn't catch Jack the Ripper because his family did. The police didn't figure out who Jack the Ripper was because his family did, and his family confined him. We're not even talking about being institutionalized. We're talking about being confined to the home in some way, doing something somehow, some type of homebound restraint, but they confined him to the home. And that is something that is just absolutely entirely possible. But at the same time, that's all just speculation and conjecture, and there's not going to be a lot of physical evidence to support something like that. But it becomes very interesting when you're looking at suspects such as Aaron Kosminski, or even a suspect like perhaps such as Chaim, someone who was dealing with violent episodes after epileptic seizures. Did he not undergo something like that? Or Jacob Levy, a butcher who had syphilis in the area. Was there not some type of homebound confinement that would explain the infrequency in activities of Jack the Ripper? Now the next line, ruses, cons, tricks, and surprises. Now it's really interesting that they would differentiate between all of these points here on the list. Ruses, cons, tricks, and surprises. And I think that is one that is a little bit hard to differentiate, because surprises, absolutely, I think Jack the Ripper surprised the women. I don't think any of the women were immediately threatened by Jack the Ripper, because that's what a lot of people just believe about serial killers, or maybe that's too general of a statement, but they think that Jack the Ripper was the type of person who was just going to sneak up on someone and he was going to commit the crime, catching the women off guard. There might not have been a very long conversation, maybe a few words, but other than that, it was just kind of like making sure the coast was clear, getting her attention for a single second, and then doing something to silence her, and then murdering her. Now, as far as ruses, cons, and tricks, well, that wouldn't mean that there were a lot of cons or tricks. That's pretty much focusing more on himself rather than on the victim. That's pretty much focusing on his ability to make sure the coast is clear, his ability to make sure that no one else is around, and his ability to commit the crime with a clear exit strategy. So I don't really think that ruses, cons, or tricks are necessary. Tricks maybe like maybe offering her some money or something like that. That could be a trick. Maybe a ruse just for a second, like asking her to come with him. And if the story that is true, that Mary Kelly was walking with a man and George Hutchinson was not, hypothetically, Jack the Ripper, then there would be some type of ruse involved, because, or at the very least, she was tricked into going to the room with some man who was there to kill him, but to kill her. But with cons, I don't really see any evidence of any type of major con job going on. I mean, it's possible that ruses and tricks took place, but definitely there are surprises. Now here's one that I jumped ahead on the list of, and it's called life deterioration or improvement. Now what exactly should this be about? Well, let's look at the suspects who are experiencing either life deterioration or improvement. People whose lives are falling apart and going into shambles, and other people who are perhaps on the up and they feel that they are untouchable. And there's a very fascinating Jack the Ripper suspect out there named Jacob Eisenschmidt, whom I haven't talked about a lot on this channel. And Jacob Eisenschmidt was a butcher in the area. He was a Jewish butcher who had recently lost his business, and he had mental health problems. And when I first learned about him a long time ago, I was thinking, whoa, wait a second, this guy sounds like he's matching all of the profiles of Jack the Ripper. He sounds like he's just matching up with all of these different points. I mean, because Jack the Ripper clearly had some familiarity with anatomy and organs, and a lot of people think that Jack the Ripper was indeed a butcher, and he just lost his business. He has a reason for experiencing some type of mental anguish, partnered with the fact that he goes on to become institutionalized later on because of his mental health issues. So you have a mentally unstable guy who is completely familiar with cutting out organs and such in the area, who just lost his business and having the worst time of his life. Yeah, okay, that might make sense, but it appears that Jacob Eisenschmidt was not incarcerated, he was institutionalized and hospitalized during a large period of the Ripper activities, and some sources will even state that he was 100% exonerated because of the documented hospitalization. So that means that most likely he was not Jack the Ripper. Now the next one, DNA technology. Okay, well this is a very fascinating one, and I'm going to go out on a very long limb and say somebody like Russell Edward is going to tell you that, yeah, they have the Ripper's DNA, and his name was Aaron Kosminski. He was a Polish barber, hairstylist, and knew a little bit about surgery. But I'm going to be the person who's going to rain on everybody's parade, but trying to do it in a good way and say, I don't think they have Jack the Ripper's DNA. I know that might not be what some people want to hear, but I want to be very, very clear and very, very precise. There might be some type of sample of DNA that exists, but I don't think that it has been properly analyzed. There might be some type of surviving genetic material from Jack the Ripper that actually is out there that could be matched via some type of descendant, but I don't think that it has been completely isolated to the point where we can say, this is Jack the Ripper's DNA. I just don't think it exists, and I think this whole thing about mitochondrial DNA matches that people have found are not impressing me at all. They do not impress me at all, and I don't really think they should impress anyone else either. They don't have Jack the Ripper's DNA, and that's the long and short of it. Now I'd like to move on to another slide here from the presentations from Joe Kennedy, again the author of Solving Cold Cases, and one of them is going to talk again about some of the stuff that definitely comes from the FBI profiler John Douglas, because John Douglas was perhaps one of the loudest voices in the 20th century of differentiating between organized crimes and disorganized crimes, organized criminals and disorganized criminals. But the fact of the matter is that these types of ideas have been shared by numerous people. And John Douglas was also not the first profiler ever. He was also not the first person to explore criminal psychology. He instead was somebody who was the most influential person on FBI psychological profiling. And perhaps it's even fair to say on psychological profiling in general in the United States of America. But let's look at the organized crimes list from Joe Kennedy in his presentation. Organized crimes are involving planning. They are methodical, intelligent. The killer stalks the victims. The victim is a stranger. Control, use of restraints, brings a weapon with them, and transports the victim. Now, is Jack the Ripper an organized criminal? Well, let's look at this again. Planning. I really don't think the Ripper had a lot of planning involved. I mean, I told you I thought he went out to commit murder, and I think that there are very clear signs of this, that the Ripper is not just doing this on a whim, like he's not just walking down the street and getting the urge. I think he went out with the specific intention to commit murder on those nights, and also methodical. Yes, I mean, so there is planning, but methodical? Yes, there are methods, because the Ripper is definitely using very methodical escape methods, I can give him that, and he's also using very methodical methods at disemboweling the women. Maybe not committing the murder specifically, strangulation and slitting the throat, but when it comes to disemboweling the women, the Ripper is very methodical. Intelligent. Was Jack the Ripper intelligent? Reasonably. I'm not convinced that the Ripper was a genius. I think the Ripper was very lucky. I think he had strong instincts. I think he had heightened predatory instincts. I'm not completely convinced that he was overly intelligent. Stalks the victim. Yeah, I think so. I think the Ripper stalked the victim just for a very short amount of time. I do not think there's any evidence to suggest that the Ripper was following the victims for like 6 weeks prior to their murders, and they were all specific targets because he liked the way they looked. No, I think they were more in vulnerable places, and then he isolated a woman who was in a vulnerable place, and then he murdered her. The victim is a stranger. It's possible, but we have no way of knowing that. If we don't know who Jack the Ripper was, how do we know that all of the victims were strangers? As I just brought up with the murder of Mary Kelly, I mean, she brought the man into the room, which she did normally. Mary Kelly was a full-time prostitute, and I mean, that's just stating a fact. And I don't think that means that she had never seen him before. And some people believe this. A lot of these discussions came up with the Long Island serial killer mystery, that the killer, well, I want to say Rex Heuermann, but let's just say the killer, was someone who had seen the women regularly, and he built up some trust with them so he could lure them to a vulnerable place, and he was just doing all the contact with burner phones, and he's parking his car around the block so no one could see who he was. And with Jack the Ripper, it's possible he had seen the women before, but we don't know who the Ripper was. If we don't know who the Ripper was, how can we say that all of the victims were total strangers? I don't think there's enough information to say that. Now, organized crimes involve control. Well, a little bit, but what real control is there? I mean, the Ripper might be murdering them quickly so they can't fight back, if you want to call that control. Use of restraints. No, I really don't think there are any use of restraints. I mean, the women are murdered outdoors, except for Mary Kelly. They are strangled and their throats are slashed rather quickly, and then they are disemboweled. But the Ripper's not using restraints when he's doing that. Brings a weapon with them. 110% yes. The Ripper is bringing a weapon with him. I mean, I should say 99.99 110% yes. The Ripper is bringing a weapon with him. Transports the victim. No, the Ripper is not transporting the victims. A lot of them is just the Ripper's meeting them outside, murdering them. And even with Mary Kelly, I mean, walking her down the street, I don't think that counts as transporting the victim. I would think that transporting would mean that he would be taking them in a horse and carriage, that they would be getting on some type of train, that they would be going on a boat together. Some way, somehow, there would be some type of actual transportation involved other than walking. I don't accept that for a second. So it seems like the Ripper has a lot of hallmarks and labels for an organized criminal. Now let's look at the disorganized crimes list. Disorganized crimes are spontaneous offenses. They know the victim. There's minimal conversation, sloppy crime scenes, the victims lie where they die, body left in view, and the evidence is present. Well, I mean, if you thought that the Ripper sounded like an organized criminal, the Ripper also sounds like a disorganized criminal, right? Right. Spontaneous offenses. And I brought this up during the Zodiac Killer episode, so I'm just going to be very brief. There are no real spontaneous crimes because, I mean, people who have personalities and identities don't do things in a spontaneous way. Spontaneous refers to things like combustion and particles, things that do not have identities. But as far as a spontaneous offense, what I think they mean is impulsive, absolutely not planned. And I've said before, I think the Ripper did plan this. They know the victim. Well, insufficient evidence for that. If I'm saying there's insufficient evidence that the Ripper did not know the victim, there's insufficient evidence that the Ripper did know the victim. I mean, you out there, can you tell me who Jack the Ripper was? If you can, please put it in the comments section down below. I would love to know, but I don't know who Jack the Ripper was. And there's minimal conversation. Yes. I do think the Ripper may have said some words. I mean, it's possible. It's possible that some of the women, maybe even all of the women except Mary Kelly, were completely blindsided by Jack the Ripper. And a lot of people will dispute that, though, because there are men that are seen in the area where they don't have an absolutely good look at the person's face, but they do see a man who is in the area or near or around the women who were murdered. So there could be some type of minimal conversation going on. And to be honest with you, in all honesty, I think there was some type of minimal conversation going on. Sloppy crime scenes. Yes, the Ripper had sloppy crime scenes. He is cutting apart women in the streets. We're talking about on the streets of London. I mean, we're talking about in Mary Kelly's bedroom at 13 Miller's Court. We're talking about slashing Liz Stride's throat and hiding in the shadows. We're talking about cutting out a woman's uterus, cutting out a woman's kidney. Yes, the Ripper had extremely sloppy crime scenes. I mean, unless you're going to use some type of twisted roundabout way and just say, well, that was what he was intending to do the whole time, therefore it's neat. I don't really think of that as a neat crime scene. I would think that a neat crime scene would be something like more where the victim was completely restrained and then they were stabbed to death in a very, very orderly manner. Like if you ever watched the show Dexter or something like that, and he creates a kill room for his victims, that would be a neat crime scene. I think the Ripper had very sloppy crime scenes. Victims lie where they die. 120% yes. Even with Mary Kelly, she was left where she died. All the victims were found where they died, to the best of my knowledge. I mean, unless you're going to entertain some other theory that it was Sir William Gull in a carriage, and he murdered the women and cut them apart in a carriage, and then their bodies were pulled out by the carriage driver onto the street. But I don't think that that's what happened. And then victims lie where they die? Absolutely. Now, the body was left in view? Absolutely. I mean, with at least 4 of the crimes, yes, they are left in view. Evidence was present? Somewhat. I mean, there are all types of things that are left behind. Like, for example, after the murder of Catherine Eddowes, which I haven't talked about too much in this episode, there was a bloody piece of her apron that was found near the Goulston Street graffito. I mean, that is some evidence that was present. And I mean, evidence, that's such a vague term. I mean, would a footprint count as evidence or something like that? Do they mean like leaving behind the murder weapon? Or do they mean that the Ripper would have cut himself and left his own blood behind? Perhaps, but we didn't have DNA technology and DNA capabilities back in 1888. So, evidence present, I mean, yes, there was evidence that was present, but I think this just goes to show you that there is an enormous blend of organized and disorganized activities in the Ripper. If anything, that goes to show that the Ripper had very muddled thinking, that the Ripper was a very chaotic individual. And if I could construct my own ability to try and decipher this chaos, I would expect that the Ripper was somebody who did have outside help, that was restricted from his movements at a certain point, that was extremely dangerous, that was not always able to put on this cool, gentle, calm, and collected act, and then just erupt in rage when he attacked the women. I think he had other warning signs of mental instability. He didn't only deal with silent rage. He would have fits of rage outside of his daily life, and people would be well aware of that, and somebody helped him cover it up. I think he was aware of everything that he was doing. I think that he may have had some type of psychotic disorder. That's not impossible, but I don't think he was experiencing true psychotic episodes when this took place, or at the very least, he wasn't experiencing something akin to clinical schizophrenia when these things were taking place, unless it was in some type of dormant state. You know, that's always possible. But those are just my immediate takes on the subject. If anything, this goes to show that the Ripper had some type of desire, some type of urge, and some type of feeling that he wanted to put into action when it came to not only attacking women, but mutilating them to prove that he had the ability to have power over them. And this all comes back to control. The Ripper was somewhat organized and somewhat disorganized, and that's why he has confused everybody. That's why this is still a mystery. And the Ripper was also perhaps not leaving a lot of evidence behind because he was good at hiding in the shadows. He was a very cunning individual, which again goes back to awareness. And I said that George Hutchinson may have gone up a few notches in my book, but that doesn't mean that I think that he was Jack the Ripper 100%. But what do you think? Do you have a Jack the Ripper suspect? Is there somebody that you would like to talk about? And do you think that Jacob Eisenschmidt deserves another look, even though I said that he's mostly been exonerated? I would love to know what you guys think, and you can put your ideas in the comment section down below. Anybody can write the show at blackboxonlineradio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook name is Ned DeHaan, but there's also a Black Box Online Radio Facebook page by itself, Black Box Online Radio, that I'm going to be using more this year. And there was always Black Box Ned 88 on TikTok and Instagram, where you can get lots of shorts and true crime reels. And I will see you over there. Until next time.